Turn up the dive, feel the vibe, get ready to ignite. Untold stories in the airways, flying through the night. Experience voices, tales so bold. Streaming live, the truth unfolds. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's so I remember I share and subscribe. Join the side where truth can't hide. Aliens in the attic, UFOs in the sky. Cryptids lurking, oh my, oh my. Ghosts in the hallway, whispering your name. The paranormal, the unexplained. Become a VIP, get the inside scoop. Unlock the mysteries, be part of the group. Live streaming stories, they're talking to you. Super chats buzzing, join the crew. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's a wild member ride. Share and subscribe, join the side where truth can hide. So if you've got the guts and you want to explore, tune into the Untold, it's what you're looking for. From aliens to ghosts and all that's unseen. Untold Radio Network, where the world's mysteries remain.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Well, good evening, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and as always, I'm delighted that you can join me tonight, whether you're watching live on X or on Facebook or on YouTube, or whether you're listening to the show later on one of the many podcast platforms that this show and all the other shows from the Untold Radio Network go out on. Tonight, as you can see, it's just like those old glorious days of Mysterious Library. I have with me one of my dearest friends in the world, biblical researcher, paranormal investigator or researcher, artist, author, and he lives with his family in a wonderful little place called Waxahachie, Texas. Welcome, Jason McLean.
Waxahachie. Yeah, you're never going to get that one right, man.
Really not.
And I can only tell that joke so many times.
I know. I wasn't trying to be funny. I really can't get that word right ever. I knew I'd get it wrong again, so I did the setup.
You know what? I'll give it to you because you're Australian.
Well, thank you. There's lots of people in the chat tonight, which is awesome. And if people are wondering why I'm looking off screen who are watching live, I've had a weird tech issue recently with my camera, so I'm running it off in a different system. It should be fixed in a week. I have a very good friend, Douglas Pryor, or Kerry Pryor, as those of you who are in the horror world know. He's the director of The Revenant. He worked on the Phantasm movies, hundreds of other awesome effects-driven Hollywood films. It's wonderful to see Horace Smith here, Ken Rock, Joe Fox. It's awesome to see everybody who's in the chat. I'm really grateful for your being here. I'm particularly grateful that you bailed me out, Jason, because I've been so busy with Midwest Weird Fest and a night of horror bearing down on me, which is just like 8-9 days to go. It kicks off on Thursday, March 6th until Sunday, March 9th. Wow. They both do in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Yeah. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the festival tonight. I'm just grateful that you're here to chat, and I'm so delighted. Siru Papers is coming back.
Yeah. This is a great time. It actually comes back tomorrow at noon on YouTube and Rumble. And yeah, it's going to be set up a little differently. We're going to do 1, maybe 2 episodes a month. They're not going to be fancily edited or anything like that. I don't have the time or the money for something like that tonight, at all at the moment. But it's simply going to be shorter, 10, 15-minute episodes. Some will be longer if needed. And we're just going to explore a lot of different topics and ideas. And tomorrow's going to be, why does the paranormal matter? Right? It's easy for people to kind of skip over things and say, well, what does it matter? What does it have to do with the cost of tea in China, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about tomorrow. And like I said, they're meant to be short and something easily shareable for particular topics. And yeah, we're going to talk about everything, including, of course, you got to talk about Bigfoot, and of course, you got to talk about Revelation. We'll be going through a whole thing on my work in eschatology. So you don't have to buy the books. You can just watch the videos. And then we'll do some biblical stuff also on the fun side, some connections. Like one of the episodes is going to be connecting the 12 apostles to the 12 sons of Israel, or technically Jacob to start off with, and what those parallels are supposed to tell us as the readers. So yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun.
We always have fun when we chat. I'm so super, and speaking about how busy you are, I can't wait to get to the conference that you guys are running too. I meant to say that up front.
Yeah, well, and I thank you for reminding me. I would have completely forgotten. But yes, we're running a conference in September, and a certain somebody, hold on, it's always reversed. I have to mess it up first. A certain somebody's going to be speaking there. It's him, in case you haven't figured it out. Yeah, it's... I wonder what you'll be. Yeah, I wonder what you'll be talking about, Dean. It's a mystery for all.
So Serial Papers has kicked off already. You said people can go see the first episode. You just literally uploaded the first new episode now.
Yeah, it goes live tomorrow at noon, Central Standard, aka God's time zone. But yeah, we'll be live tomorrow. Again, all the episodes are going to be pre-recorded, short, pithy, and like I said, in the future, we're going to have more episodes with bigger topics, and so we'll have all of the reference material in the description, right? It's going to be fun, and we're going to have a lot of material in there, and I don't want you to trust me on anything. I want you to go look at the material yourself. I think that's one of the things I would like to do is, instead of it just being a place where you can just go and be entertained, but a place where you can be really educated as well.
Well, that's something you've always done so well. That's why I miss doing Mysterious Library with you so much, because you brought such knowledge and insight to that show. And I think
I missed the show too.
Sorry, what's that?
Oh, I missed the show too. It was a great time.
Yeah, it was so rewarding to do it with you, to be honest. And that's one of the reasons because we both couldn't do it together, we kind of stopped doing it. Was the reason the show came to an end. But let's dig into some of these things, because I think there used to be, I mean, there still is in some places in the world, but there used to be in the West a specific way that the paranormal was understood. And perhaps the men of letters still understood it that way. C.S. Lewis still understood, for example, the paranormal in that capacity. Other people did as well, up into probably the 20th century. But now a lot of the older approaches, the traditional approaches, the biblical approaches have been all but forgotten. And when we talk about it like that, it sounds like it's dry and it's, not interesting. But you're always able to approach this material, meaning paranormal phenomenon, through a biblical lens and look at it in a specifically interesting way. Do you see that we've kind of fallen away from looking at the paranormal and the supernatural like that? Yeah.
Absolutely. And by the way, thank you, Horace. I think we all do. It's good to see some of the old names in the chats. I very much appreciate what you said there. I try, right? I mean, I don't know that I do it very well, but I at least make the attempt, right? And yeah, I would suggest that, maybe some of the men of letters, like you said, your C.S. Lewis's, even your Tolkien's, in the early 20th century, maybe even more, still had at least a degree of a supernatural worldview. But by the time you get post-World War II, there's this sort of revolution in thinking, and it's the in many ways, it's, you hit the atomic age. It's the age of science, right? We'll come back to that here in a second. But essentially, it becomes a very materialist worldview by default. And so, even in people who would say that, yeah, no, I believe in the Bible, and it's like, yeah, but you don't. Not really. Maybe in the ways that matter, yes. But the supernatural sort of just becomes all superstition. And things that don't fit into a Darwinian worldview become superstition. And the baby's thrown out with the bathwater. Because don't get me wrong, there is a lot of superstition out there, and it's not always good. Also, superstition isn't always what you think it is. But that's an entirely different conversation. But we sort of reject it. I would suggest that a lot of churches became functionally deist in a way, if not straight up Gnostic. And so what we're seeing is a resurgence of people saying, hold on, this doesn't fit with the world we actually live in, right? It's not what we're seeing. It's not what we're interacting with. And something I mentioned in the episode, not to spoil it, it's a 10-minute episode, but that I think people have legitimately been hurt by this lack of understanding of the of not just the supernatural, but definitely the supernatural, right? This rejection of the other half of reality, or even a greater reality, has been suppressed and sort of ignored. And I think it's hurt people. I think not just, I think it's ruined their lives. I think it's led people to make very bad decisions. I think it's been damaging overall, and people are starting to come around and say, hey, hold on, we got to figure this out. The problem is we lost a lot of vocabulary along the way. And that's what I would like to do, is sort of reintroduce this vocabulary in ways of thinking and ways of talking about it. Because we, as humans, we express everything through language, even in our minds, right? For those who are long time, who remember the old days of Mysterious Library, one of my favorite things is talking about the Dwarf-Sapir hypothesis, which basically says that if you don't have, again, an overly simplified version of it, is if you don't have a word for something, it becomes very hard to understand it. And we see this in even things like color, that if you don't have a name for a particular color, it becomes very hard to pick it out. And think about all the times in your life when you're trying to express something and you can't, and then someone gives you a word for it, and you're like, yes, that's the word I'm looking for, and the entire concept that you were thinking of becomes more clear, becomes into focus. It's the same thing. We have a very limited vocabulary when it comes to the supernatural, the cryptozoological, all of it. And we need to bring some of these ideas back and refocus them so we can have a more productive conversation on everything.
I think so too. What I always find troubling is an exaggeration, but strange, is that there are so many people who are interested in the type of phenomena which we talk about on shows like this, but they seem to understand. And Horace Smith, Professor Emeritus of Astronomy and Physics at Michigan State University, is about to, I'm sure, get mad with me. But people who are interested in the paranormal but have to try to approach it from a scientific perspective, like I think it's because we exist in this space where science has been elevated to the arbitrator of reality and of truth, that they don't think you can even talk about ghosts without talking about science. That there's somehow going to be some way we can get to the bottom of all of this through some scientific methodology, whether it's Bigfoot or whether it's UFOs or whether it's, again, ghosts, whatever it is. There's this idea that, we can pull out the ghost reader meter, or we can cast the Bigfoot print and find the DNA, or we can, find the crash piece of the Roswell saucer and analyze it. There's always this idea that it can be solved scientifically. Of course, people have taken this approach now of all that various phenomena for over a century, depending on what it is, and we're no closer to any answers. And I suspect one of the reasons we struggle so much with understanding much of this, in a way that our ancestors and our forebears didn't struggle with it, is so many people, both within a Christian culture or within cultures of other mystical or religious perspectives. They didn't have to try to understand this within the constructs of a scientific paradigm. They understood it for what it was, something other, and that was part of the paradigm that they lived in. It was part of their cosmology. Well, today, because we have a very strict scientific paradigm for the most part has discarded any sense of supernaturalism or the paranormal, we're at a loss in many ways of how we approach this as human beings in the 21st century, when we're told that science knows best, but science has no way of really exploring this because it's outside the paradigm, and perhaps because it can't be explored. But if you go back to earlier, I suppose, Christian ideas or ideas in any of the different religious systems, these things were explainable. They fit in within those constructs very easily. But today we struggle because we throw in so much of those older ideas away, I think.
Well, first of all, thank you, Horace. He's waiving his objections for you, Dean. So it's mighty kind of you. So actually, let me be the fence straddler between the two of you that I always am, right? Which is that you're not wrong, and I actually don't disagree with you at all. That unfortunately, the problem is what we've deemed sort of the scientific worldview is, in many ways, the problem is it's taking the scientific method and turning it to something that it's not. It's not. There is a philosophy of science, true, but science is simply the attempt to understand the material world around us and its protocols for exploring that universe. That's it. That's all it can be. Unfortunately, many people have placed it a little bit higher up on the food chain than it should be. Kicking it out is a terrible idea. However, it also has been played in many cases. People are it's like, well, this guy has a white lab coat. He can tell me everything about everything. No, that's not how any of this works. Science is an exploration, which is why it's useful. However, good science also knows where it's like, well, I can't do anything with this because this is outside the ability to test. Unfortunately, what's really happened is it's not science versus religion. It's religion versus religion. And we've talked about this. The real on the previous show. It's a materialist. I've been up too long. A materialist worldview versus a theological worldview. If your worldview is that there is no such thing as a supernatural, everything's material, everything is simply cause and effect, then you're going to view reality very, very differently. And you're going to rely on things that are testable, things that you can pick up and poke with the stick, like my trusty pen here, right? It's not, and the problem is, science is useful for where it's useful, but it's not really the basis for a religious worldview, which is really what the argument is, right? So when you sort of realize, hold on, science is a useful tool where it is useful. And let it be that. Let it be what it is. Don't try and, again, it's like everyone's trying to turn cauliflower into pizza dough and rice. And it's like, no, stop. Cauliflower is just like you're asking an awful lot of a cruciferous vegetable over here. Let cauliflower be what it is. Let science be what it is. Right? And it's very valuable and useful there because I think that there's a lot of information we've been able to use because of science. Particularly with things like archaeology, and AI has been very useful for decoding and reading scrolls that we couldn't even open a few years ago. And so as a tool, it's wonderful. Hey, Sandra. But as anything else, it's not really the basis for a philosophical understanding of the world because it's by nature, it requires an omission of something other than the material world. If you want to use it as a foundational, a foundation for a philosophical worldview. And the problem is, it's experientially clear that there is something above and beyond the reality that we live in. Just because we can't touch it, taste it, poke it with a stick doesn't make it not real. I mean, imagine going back 600 years and saying, okay, well, I'm going to explain germ theory to these people. It wasn't that they were dumber than we are. There was just no reason. There was no way of observing that reality. There just wasn't. And then all of a sudden, boom, microscopes show up on the scene. They're like, oh, hey, here's all these things we didn't even know existed. That's the supernatural world. It is a universe very different from ours. Rules probably beyond our ability to understand them. And the problem is, like you said, there is no Spookatron 5000, patent pending, that we can point at and start beeping and objectively observe how any of that works. So within that weirdness, that's where you have to kind of look at other options. We should still be methodical about it. We should still take notes. I still think there's a lot to draw out of science for researching it. And I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are in this, in that, yeah, if it's paranormal, truly paranormal, meaning supernatural, yeah, we're not objectively, but I think we can find patterns that would indicate this is at least a real phenomena. And by the way, stay the heck away from it, or how to, but then there's other things that we can draw conclusions from them. We may not be able to understand the way we understand what a dog is, or what this pen is, but understanding that it's there is valuable in and of itself because of what it indicates. Now, again, the problem is, now we're back to, well, whose book do you choose? Well, that's for everyone to kind of pick at, and there's other reasons to look at. Why I would suggest something like the Christian Bible. Others would, point to others. Well, we're going to have those conversations as well. In fact, Donnie Cho and I, it's not slated yet, we're going to be doing a debate on reincarnation in the near future. So it'll be
nice.
Yes, it'll be fun. So we're going to have a lot of fun in these fields. And like I said, you're not wrong. I don't disagree on any one point. Only that I think the problem is people putting things where they don't belong. Right. In fact, that's really what I want to do with Siru, is actually say, hey, let's put things where they need to be. Because I would suggest some people take things like the Nephilim and make them more important than they are, more influential than they are. And I will not leave cauliflower alone, Douglas. I will never leave it alone. Cauliflower just wants to be a cruciferous vegetable. It's all it wants to be, man. It doesn't want to be a pizza. So yeah, just leave it alone. Just eat it. Throw some butter on it. It's wonderful. It's really not. But that's, that's a taste thing. So, there's going to be a lot of fun exploring these things. And I think we need to build back, more useful vocabulary and worldviews, and understanding where a worldview is coming from, so you can have a more useful conversation. Because I think that's really what's held a lot of this back. And here's where I'm going to push back on you about the whole, well, we've done this for 100 years. We really, really haven't. We really haven't. Not really. And again, let's be honest, the real search for Bigfoot, it's not even really 60 years old, dude. I mean, that's the Patterson-Gimlin film is basically 60 years old. That kind of pushed the actual search for these things more into the mainstream, so it's larger, more resources. It's only been 60 years. There's a ton of animals that we had reports on, and it took 200 years for someone to actually find one. So, now again, another 60 years, I think you'll have a point.
Well, I was referring to the broader field, in fairness. So, for example, ufology is almost 80 years old now. Mm-hmm. Spectre hunting is probably 150 plus years old now. Mm-hmm. So cryptozoology is a little more recent. But if we average it out, I think
I get what you're saying.
Is fair. And we don't know anything more. And none of these fields know anything more. Anything more conclusive, nothing more conclusive is known about UFOs or Bigfoot or specters. Nothing.
Well, so
I think I'm not just blaming science, although I partly am. I'm blaming people who think that it can be solved in that way, when the great granddaddy of all of this, Charles Fort, in many ways, or it's at least, one of his biographies is called What Charles Fort, like the father of the supernatural or something, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but the fact that he understood very early on that science was incapable of dealing with things that far outside of the paradigm. He didn't call it the paradigm. Thomas Kuhn
Right. Yeah.
kind of coined that term 40 years after Fort was writing the exact same thing. But it seems to me that that science, or the scientific, even the scientific method, is incapable of dealing with these things. But I think more to the point, talking about the modern church and its failings, which you were doing before, and I totally agree with. I suspect some of that is a kind of a Me Tooism, in that the church didn't want to present itself as being unscientific or unreasonable or unrational or unenlightened in an era where all of those ideas, enlightenment, rationality, science, had kind of become had risen to the prominence of cultural authority above the church. The church, instead of kind of fighting back and saying, well, you might be right about, this aspect of reality, but you don't understand anything about these aspects of reality. Instead, it becomes this battle of pretending that it's not supernatural, when the key tenets of Christianity, even if you remove the demons and the ghosts and all the other paranormal, paraphernalia and incidents, the very idea that God was somehow able to come here and incarnate as a man and then, die for our sins, and the key tenets of Christianity are crazy as supernatural than talking about Bigfoot or UFOs or ghosts or anything. But the church tends to be very reserved about much of the discussion when it comes to the paranormal, supernatural. So it just seems so weird, to me.
And that's actually something we're going to address very early in the show, because I agree. One of the things I've talked about for a while now is, you claim you believe in a supernatural being that supernaturally created the universe, supernaturally sent his son, who died, was buried, was supernaturally resurrected, supernaturally sent to heaven, and yet you don't believe in the supernatural, right? It's like there's a disconnect here. And I want to talk about, I want to address your point. I want to come back to the UFO aspect to your conversation in a little bit, because I think it's a very different conversation in a way, but I don't think Charles Fort was wrong, right? At all, in saying that truly the supernatural aspect of this, and this, I think we need to stop being afraid of it's like, well, we got to use the word interdimensional or energy. No, it's supernatural. It's what it is, right? I think he's right in that we won't be able to understand it the way we would understand, again, cauliflower, since that's the topic of the evening. We understand cauliflower. No, I'm not actually. I'm Protestant. And we won't understand the way we can understand cauliflower or dogs or this pen. But science can point out at least the fact that we know that there is a value to scientifically exploring it as far as we can. But I would suggest the difference is, can we understand it scientifically? No. In fact, I would suggest what we need to do is actually again, putting things where they belong. What can science tell us? Great. Because if we can validate that there is a phenomena, that's great. And if that's as far as we can go, then just say, look, this is where we can go. We're done. But then we have to turn to things like Revelation, not necessarily the book, but, there, there he is. I called you out earlier, Donnie, by the way, about our little debate upcoming. We have to explore it in another way. But being able to say scientifically, look, there is validity to this reality, and that's as far as we can go, I still think is a win. Because that's still saying we've proven that this exists. But I agree with Fort that the truly bizarre, the stuff that's really out, again, that is supernatural, is not really within our wheelhouse to understand, but we can know it. We can know that it's there and the potential dangers. But I don't think everything that's weird necessarily falls into the supernatural per se. I think there's other things that are more in our space, right? I like to call them nobies or naturally occurring biological entities. But other things aren't, and some things may be in between, right? This is your point with Bigfoot, which is that maybe some of these things are only temporarily physical. I'm very okay with that possibility for a lot of reasons. But I think there's at least enough evidence to say, look, we really shouldn't give up on there being a physical Bigfoot, but that perhaps a lot of these other encounters aren't. That it's not even Bigfoot to begin with. And this is where the scientific endeavor of actually cataloging things and cross-referencing, having a little bit of discipline, and can actually be very useful. Right? And this is where these things can become, where we can use things that we've learned from science to help understand some of the phenomena that people are encountering.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems is that science itself, Fort was tough on science, but Fort really just says earlier than the exact same thing the greatest philosopher of science ever said, and that's Thomas Kuhn. And that was that we don't actually, or that science doesn't work the way that your average person thinks science works and has been taught that science works. And that's the idea that somebody learns something and somebody else learns something that stacks up and we get closer to some universal knowledge. Science actually works within paradigms. A popular paradigm comes around, often presented by the most popular kids in the scientific institution, and then everybody jumps on board. And the rest of science, or the rest of scientists, operate within that paradigm, doing what Thomas Kuhn called as mop-up work, trying to make everything fit within that paradigm. And it isn't that there's these great new discoveries. What happens is eventually that paradigm becomes so threatened by things that don't fit in it that cracks appear in the paradigm. And it can take a long time, and eventually that paradigm collapses from all of the cracks and a new paradigm arises. Again, normally because people who are popular or perceived as, being clever rise to the top and present this new paradigm, and the process starts again. But Thomas Kuhn said, perhaps being a little less cranky in his voice than Charles Fort was 40 years before.
Yeah.
Thomas Kuhn said that new paradigm isn't necessarily more honest than a more accurate portrayal of objective reality than that previous paradigm was. It just did a better job of explaining some of the cracks. It doesn't mean it's any truer. And that's the way science operates. Again, Thomas Kuhn isn't some cranky Fortian. He's genuinely perceived as the greatest philosopher of science ever. But that very conversation, he was a scientist himself, but that very conversation isn't had within science usually. And why? Because every scientist is normally operating within the paradigm. It's like a goldfish in a bowl. You don't want to admit your reality. You just want to work on, doing the best you can within it. You're not yourself. You're not trying to break out of the bowl. You're just doing whatever you can within it. And that's what most scientists do. No offense, Horace. But I think Charles Fort and Thomas Kuhn said essentially the same thing. So when these paranormal problems start banging on the door of it, it doesn't you can't just present a photo of a ghost and science opens up, or some weird, we've got what looks like a strange DNA fragment from a Bigfoot hair and it's a weird sample, and all of a sudden the scientific doors open and Bigfoot's real, because that isn't the way science, it just doesn't work that way.
I know Horace is throwing his slippers at
I'm sure,
at his laptop right now.
Love you, Horace.
Love you too. So let me agree, but point out that there's two things, right? Is that, yes, the paradigms rise and fall. New paradigms arise. However, the new paradigms arise out of the fact that the prior paradigm was destroyed, right? The fact that the overwhelming evidence, now it may take a while for that paradigm to fall, because often there's money involved in science, and that's the dirty little secret no one really wants to talk about. But yeah, I mean, I understand your point. I think it's a little uncharitable only to a point, though, because I don't think it's entirely wrong. I do think that, again, back to my original analogy of 600 years ago, right? And people not having a microscope, there was a reality to the world that people lived in that they had no idea of because they couldn't observe it. In the same way, we are limited by our ability to observe reality. And let's just suggest that perhaps a new paradigm does form, it's slightly more accurate. It may not necessarily be that by the degree it's more accurate is necessarily more true, only that it's a little bit more workable. Again, I think your biggest issue is really with the philosophy or utilizing science as the foundational principle for a worldview and philosophy instead of it being a tool and a useful tool. And I think, again, going back to the idea of money, I think one of the dangers, and this is where I want to come back to on your comment about ufology, about how it's like we're not any closer. Well, we're not really any closer because I think it's very, very clear that we were opposed by our own government, and that largely ufology has been manipulated the entire way for completely different purposes. So, yeah, some of this stuff is a little bit older. I mean, heck, you could argue that paranormal research goes back to the dawn of time, right? What we would call poltergeists have been written about since the 1st century, if not before. So yeah, some of the stuff, but again, the thing is, they all just recognized there was a reality. There was a supernatural world, and that it wasn't always a good thing to interact with it. Even people that, people would call pagans were like, yeah, not everything should be played with, right? But when it comes to something like ufology, post-World War II, that's all, again, which is really when that starts, that's all been manipulated by the government, as we've discussed previously, both on this show and on our previous show together.
I would just interject quickly because I don't disagree with you,
Oh, yeah.
but I think while the government might have played with it and spun it and all these things, I think again it was science that was the death knell for any objective. If there can be such a thing, I don't think there can be, but if we want to talk about an objective approach, because it's the Condon Committee in 1968 and in 1969, when under the pressure of Gerald Ford and other people in Congress. The U.S. Air Force, after Hynek comes out and makes that ridiculous statement that it was swamp gas in Michigan, when so many people saw these weird lights and it clearly wasn't swamp gas. After that debacle, Project Blue Book, the Air Force's supposed UFO investigating arm, but came under such public scrutiny that Gerald Ford, again, because he was a congressman from Michigan where this happened, put pressure on the Air Force to hand this over to a scientific investigation, which was, a non-government investigation, supposedly. It was the University of Colorado, headed by Edward Condon, and it was their results that essentially were biased from the get-go. We know because of the Lowe memo, when one of the main insiders wrote this memo saying, well, we know just as far as how they should be face fronting. Well, we know this is all nonsense, and we want to make sure that our friends in the scientific other institutions we know that it's nonsense, but we want the public to think we're approaching this objectively. Right. That was essentially what the Lowe memo said. And when that was leaked, the results were instant, again, rightfully so, distrust in the scientific establishment by the UFO people, the UFO community, ufologists. And that is what caused Jacques Vallée, who was obviously an associate of J. Allen Hynek's. He and Hynek had both been sharing their files with the Condon Committee. That was what made, literally, it was the same as when Nietzsche heard a Wagner opera and walked away and changed his entire philosophy. Jacques Vallée walked out of hearing that and threw his first 2 books of scientific ufology overboard and wrote Passport to Magonia. And Passport to Magonia is essentially, along with John Keel and maybe some stuff by Steiger and a couple others, one of the key original texts of the new ufology. And the new ufology was anti-science, essentially. And what Vallée says in that is science is incapable of dealing with this because of the Condon Committee. He doesn't actually, I don't think he even spells out the Condon Committee, but that's what he's reacting to. And he says this resembles older traditional and folkloric and religious and occult phenomena. And that's where the answer is. And so I think science in many ways is to blame for people like me, because clearly I'm influenced by Vallée and Keel and Harper and Steiger and those people. And so in many ways, I'm a child of the Condon Committee. I'm a result, too, of the scientific institution, the scientific establishment not approaching this stuff objectively. having their own biases within their paradigm and refusing to look at it with any kind of, scientific objective lens. And as a result, what happens? You get people like me. You get people like Belay. You get people like Keel. You get people like Steiger. So science, it's science in many ways, just like Fort was writing a reaction to the science of the early 20th century. People like Keel and Belay were reacting to the science of the mid to latter 20th century.
Yeah. Horace, what I just heard is he blames you for all of this. And so you're responsible for Dean. So yeah, again, allow me to take everything you said, agree with it, and twist it just a hair and say, but that is actually how science works. You had bad science being done, right? Then you have the other people saying, okay, well, hold on. Let's push back against this idea. I would suggest it's science being done on both sides. Now, the problem is there is a corrupt science. There is a corrupt paradigm. And yeah, because it's government funded, and they have their own agendas, like, not wanting to be arrested for treason because of Operation Paperclip and stuff like that, right? Again, then we hit the 80s, and it's all hands on deck for the craziness of that. But again, that's a different conversation that we've had a lot, and in previous episodes. Go watch the previous episodes, everyone, if you're new. Dean needs the watch time. But yeah, I mean, so allow me to push back and say that's actually how science works. Someone says, hey, this is what's going on. Someone says, no, that's not. And they push back against one another. Now, the big problem here is we don't really have necessarily a truly scientific conversation happening, because we have one that's protected by the money and the power, because these scientists are saying what the government wants them to say. And then you have the other people who are trying to actually figure this out. That pushback, that conflict, that's actually science happening. We're just the benefit of thousands of years of this process. Go read the Greeks. They got wild with their with their conversations on stuff. It's and this is how this works. I think we have this very post World War II hubris of how this is supposed to go, where everyone is in it. It's the propaganda. Everyone's in it for the good, for the betterment of mankind. People, we're pushing forward, and we're all going to be polite and civilized about it. We're spoiled by the last couple hundred years of that, at least of some of the propaganda and the way it worked in many realms and many fields. We forget that it's been a pretty hard battle. People shot each other over stuff like this in the past, right? I would suggest the conflict is itself still science, because you have to have that pushback. There has to be someone showing up and throwing out the information saying, here's the crack in that theory, here's the crack in this theory, here's this other crack in that theory, to destroy that paradigm. It's just harder because we have a government-sponsored paradigm. But guess what? There were government-sponsored paradigms in the past too, right? Everyone had a government-sponsored paradigm until it failed, until the government needed a new paradigm, or it became there was just simply too much evidence. Everyone's like, yeah, we're going to go ahead and change this. That's just how that works. I think we're spoiled by microwaves and being able to stream whatever show we want, that it's supposed to happen quickly. It doesn't. It may not even happen in our lifetimes. I mean, there were some of these discoveries that we just take for granted took centuries to figure out, and people fighting back and forth, and that's how this works. So I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about it. But again, I do fundamentally agree. Science, the truly exotic science, may not be able to understand it, because until we have that Spookatron 5000 patent pending, we're not going to be able to objectively observe it. But knowing that it's there is a step towards building a better paradigm. And right now, it's again, the first episode drops of my new podcast is dropping tomorrow at noon.
And say what it's called, because we have somebody in the chat asking.
And it's Siru Papers, SIRU Papers. In fact, if you drop it down, it should be right beneath my name if you're watching. It is Siru Papers, SIRU Papers, and it drops, the first episode drops noon tomorrow, and we'll have new stuff as I bring it up. Like I said, I want to have it not just be entertaining, but very educational. And there will be, when we go into certain topics, the description is going to have all the references, so you can actually look it up and research these things yourself and explore them yourself. You're posting Donnie's comments. That's hilarious.
Yeah, I can't not put Donnie's comments up. Donnie Cho is amazing. I need to get Donnie Cho back on. We should get a show where you and Donnie both come on Talking Weird as well. That'd be fun.
Oh, absolutely. No, Donnie, yeah, if y'all haven't watched Donnie Cho Says Stuff, then you're missing out. And yeah, to Horace's point, yeah, there's a lot more fighting at scientific meetings than people really understand. It's not as polite as the propaganda would like you to think. Like I said, but again, you go back in time just a century or even more, stuff gets wild. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, I'm not somebody who says there aren't, practical applications of discoveries of the physical world and otherwise.
Yeah.
Like I'm not dismissing the application of some science. I just think that science is lacking as a broader tool to explain the type of things that we might discuss on a show like this, for the simple reason that it's failed to do so. But well, maybe let's shift it a little bit, because we are we're probably getting to about the final quarter of the show. Tell me about like your approach biblically to these kind of issues. Like when you go back to God's word, you go back to the Bible. How do you take that when you're looking at a certain mystery or somebody's experience? Like, do you have a process how you deal with that, or even when you're analyzing it just for your own show or your own writings? Yeah,
the process is probably schizophrenic to a point. But the first thing you got to do is, honestly, is and this is, I think, really something that's been popularized recently. I'm sort of old school on this one, but is actually understanding things from their cultural perspective first, right? And trying to see what is, the message that's being said, because the Bible's not necessarily a textbook. I think that's Heiser famously. I love how you said this. We read it like we read a newspaper, and that's not how it was written, right? It may have been written for us, but it was written to them. And you need to understand those points first. So a lot of it is actually having a biblical worldview. In fact, one of the second episode, which will be dropping next month, is going to be on what is the biblical worldview. Like, what is the foundational, without getting, there's obviously a ton of nuance in a lot of these issues, but where is sort of like that baseline minimum requirement to have what would be considered a biblical worldview? And I think the problem is there's a big chunk of that missing for a lot of people, right? And so you start there with that as your foundation, and then you build on that, because it just depends on the topic, right? And that's where things get complicated, because it depends on what is that you're dealing with. Like, again, like, let's say the UFOs, which again we're definitely going to be dealing with pretty quickly. We have the complication of the government and its influence. Again, something we've talked about ad nauseum. To untangle that knot, we have to be honest about what's happening in this, and not necessarily, and understand that a lot of the people who've been talking about this for a long time may not have been on the up and up, and really start to take that apart and start saying, okay, well, what do we see? What are the patterns? How does that reflect? Do we see any precedent in Scripture for some of this stuff? And the problem is, yeah, there is a lot of precedent for some aspects that truly seems more bizarre. And then we see stuff where it's like, okay, well, we can start seeing where things are human and the government is doing things to hide its complicity in certain war crimes. And then you see this other stuff where it's like, okay, but this is the truly bizarre stuff, and it is precedented. It's not unprecedented, and we see these patterns throughout history. When it comes to things like cryptozoology, okay, well, it really comes down to, well, what kind of creature are you talking about? Is it an Obi, or are we dealing with something that's paranormal? In which case you start looking for comparisons. So it's not necessarily that all of the answers are necessarily found in Scripture, but rather having that worldview and saying, okay, how does that shape up with what we're actually seeing? What are the touchstones? What are the patterns? What are the familiarities? And go from there.
And I think that those older examinations or interactions with the type of supernatural or paranormal phenomena, again, that we talk on shows like this with, they seem to have a better understanding. There seems to have been more connection with the other or the divine, or, whatever it was. And I also always think about Irish fairy faith, and that there were very clear rules and suggestions on how you dealt with the other in fairy faith. We lack that today. So and that was obviously, some of that was stepped in Christianity, some of it was stepped in even in probably older traditions. But the point is, there were cultures, and there still are cultures around the world.
Oh yeah,
which have a far better understanding of how to deal with this kind of thing. Because if your average person in America tonight is driving home along some, dark rural back road, like where I live, and, they see some weird light in the sky and something lands, there's little creatures around it, they're kind of dumbstruck. They don't understand how to interact with that. They don't understand what they're experiencing. But if you're in Ireland, even 50, 100, 200 years ago, you knew... If you saw something weird, you knew what it was. You knew it was the She or the Fae or whatever we want to call them, the good neighbors, the other crowd. And you knew you had to be very careful dealing with them. If you bumped into them like that on a back road, you better be darn careful. And you knew what you should and what you shouldn't do. And you knew not to trust what they said. You knew not to trust what your eyes even saw, because of fairy glamour, they could trick you. But today, if somebody sees or experiences something, what do they say every time? I know what I saw.
Yeah.
But if you went back 100 years into Ireland, you would what you saw, you knew wasn't the truth, because the idea that this other phenomenon could trick you. And that's similar to some, lines in the Bible as well about, the Satan being the shining one, or, something bright, pretty. There was this idea that you had to be careful when you interacted with the other, because how it presented itself as the exterior version might not be what the real version was. But today we go, well, I saw that Bigfoot. I know what it was. It was a hairy ape relic hominid running through the woods, or that UFO was people from outer space, or that shimmering figure in my, in the dark, hallway of the family mansion was the ghost of, great aunt Gertrude. I know what I saw. But once upon a time, people would have said, you don't know what you see. It's a trick.
Right.
And we've lost that. And
no,
you know what,
have.
to be honest, and
Absolutely.
I'm going to beat up science again. In many ways, it's again because of this idea that, well, you can kind of, you can experientially work things out by observation, right? Science is about observation. But the older tradition said observations are meaningless because it tricks your senses.
Science is not a pinata, Dean, but you're not wrong. You're not wrong on that. This is where also going back and reading what other people have written about this for centuries is a really good idea, to look at the patterns, right? Again, like the good neighbors, as they would say. There's a lot of themes that get thrown about across cultures and across centuries that indicates that we're dealing with something real, right? For example, to Dean's point, if you happen to be on a back road and you hear the sound of a friend of yours calling you to come help them on the side of the road because they're just behind the tree line, no, you didn't. In virtually every culture on the planet would tell you that too. It's like you didn't hear your friend. In fact, the question that bothers me the most on this, on that one question is, we assume it's out in the wilderness where no one's around. And I'm not entirely convinced that's correct. I wonder how many people who go missing in cities go missing because they thought they heard their friend saying, "Hey, come back here behind this alley."
Interesting.
But again, topic for another day. So to your point, you're not wrong in that. I think what happened is as humans, we're pendulums. We throw babies out with bathwater, and we found the nice, shiny new tool that is science, and then we threw everything else out. And it's left us at a point where we don't really have a conversation. And this is the point of going back and reading the works of other people from centuries ago is really important, because we also have this hubris of, well, we're the first generation to try and figure this out. No, you aren't. And you're behind, and you're very much behind the curve on this, because we're dealing, to your point, with the belief that, well, we can, again, if we have this, this meter, we can prove that this thing is, no, you can't. And here's, in fact, let me present the entire problem of the K2 meters and all the other electronics. I'm not saying that it's not valuable to have those electronics in the field. I think you should have a Geiger counter with you, by the way. Right? However, all that being said, let's say you have your meter reading, right? And it starts pinging. And let's say unfortunately, a lot of people aren't properly trained on how to use that stuff anyway, but let's say you have someone who's properly trained, and it's pinging, so something's there. Are you registering the being itself? Are you measuring essentially like the wake of the being moving through, like the waves and ripples in water? Or is that thing just directly jacking with your equipment because it can? You don't know what you're getting with that. All you can say is, my meter is pinging at this frequency and this intensity right here, right now. That's it. That's all you can do. I also don't recommend talking to these things, by the way. Just full disclaimer, I do not a cotton to anybody talking to anything. Because again, if it can talk to you, it can lie to you. Straight up.
Well, that's literally what Fairy Faith said, by the way. Fairy Faith literally said, they're not going to tell you the truth. Don't have any engagement with them. And if you stumble upon them, here's what you should do and what you shouldn't do.
Exactly. No, precisely. And the idea was built in. It's like, don't trust what you're seeing. Don't trust what you're encountering. Certainly don't eat the pancakes, right? It's, and by the way, to Greg Olson's point about porcupines sound like babies crying, ravens can copy human speech. Just understand that. However, that being said, there is stuff out there that's neither porcupine or raven, and it'll get you killed. That being said, we are sort of behind the curve on this because we are so reliant on what we can see. Again, the scientific method, we can poke it with the stick. Well, this is something we can't really poke with a stick. In fact, I will go one step further. I'm not entirely convinced that the line between the psychological and the spiritual is as hard and fast as we would like it to be. Like, just straight up. It may be there's way more interplay between our brains and that phenomena than we realize. So we don't know exactly where that line, like, when are you definitively over there and when are you definitively over here? The world's just weirder than we want it to be. And we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater in this regard. So also going back and reading what other people have written about this for centuries is very, very useful. Don't presume that we're the first people to try and figure it out.
We were talking about men of letters before, and I remember another man of letters, just what you were saying then, and that's G.K. Chesterton. And I think he'd had some involvement with, with seances and the like. And he was a Christian apologist. And he said what I think applies to all of this. He said something along the lines of, I don't know what these things are. I don't know where they come from, but I know one thing, and that's that they tell you lies.
Yeah.
And I think you can spread that. Just pick your paranormal phenomena. And I think you can use Chesterton's words to pretty much envelop all of it.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And again, like I said, I think while I'm convinced that there's sufficient evidence that there is a relict population of hominoids walking around, I'm further convinced the vast majority of encounters are supernatural, and they are either deliberately choosing to appear as a quote-unquote Bigfoot, or they're simply, we are assuming that's what they are, and so that's how they're appearing to us, right? It's not as hard and fast as we want it to be, and unfortunately, because we've lost the language to communicate these ideas. And so we're very limited in this conversation, and that's what the show is. One of the things the show is trying to do is redevelop language to have a more useful conversation instead of an adversarial one. Have a useful conversation, right? I just saw Donnie's post.
Anyone who's listening, Donnie Cho says stuff. Donnie Cho, that's his show. Donnie Cho says the only one who doesn't lie is Dogman. He's the truth.
Yes, you have to watch his show to understand that comment. I saw it at the wrong time. Anyway, my point being, we have to rebuild the vocabulary to actually have a useful conversation. Imagine actually going to some of these conferences and having, instead of people devolving into name calling and fist fighting, and actually being able to move the conversation forward and to actually build maybe not necessarily consensus, but a broader field of data to start working from and actually categorizing. 'Cause I would suggest one of the things that's really held us back, to you going all the way back to the beginning of the episode with your comment, is I would suggest one of the things that's held, let's specifically focus on Bigfoot for 2 seconds. I think the problem is we have a lot of very corrupted data, right? I think that's a real problem that we have, is that we've got a lot of corrupted data. There's no way to determine what's the supernatural encounters, what may be the actual physical no-be version of Bigfoot, because some of those physical things are being misinterpreted, and some of the supernatural things are being misinterpreted, and some of the supernatural events were scrubbed by researchers that didn't believe that existed. So I would suggest one of the biggest problems that we have is that the data is corrupted. And you can't get from here to there if your data is corrupted. So we need to build better vocabulary and build a better worldview. And I would just suggest that perhaps when the worldview is done, I know which one's going to be left standing as far as the broader. Because again, it doesn't matter what Bigfoot actually is. I mean, it matters to a point. But once we put them in perspective, we fit them in their place, it's just going to be proving what the worldview is. I just happen to skip ahead to the end.
Well, Jason, I literally, there's nobody. There's some
just
funny
saw
comments
Werewolf's comment
as well. We're winding down though, or otherwise, like Kerry was asking, can you talk about the red heifers? I'm sure you probably could. And he also talked about the government covering up Bigfoot. I'm sure we could talk about that as well if we had another hour to go. But all I can say, Jason, is there's nobody I'd rather spend an hour on talking weird, chatting to than you, man. What a great joy to have you back on this show.
Hey, it's always fun, Dean. We can definitely talk about those things later. But what I will say is this, and we're going to talk about conspiracy and things like that on the channel as well. Obviously, we kind of have to. What I will say though is, it may be the things that are going on aren't necessarily what we think. And that may be the number one lesson is we come to this with certain assumptions. We may want to scrub those assumptions because it may not be what we think is happening. And so that our own assumptions may be leading us astray. Right? So yeah, come join us. Serial Papers first episode it drops tomorrow at noon. Again, they're going to be short episodes. They won't be live. They're going to be pre-recorded. And again, this one's a very sort of warm-up thing. We're going to be building certain arguments over time. But we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to show, and when we talk about specific topics, we're going to show references so that you can also research this yourself and that you can understand where this is coming from, and not just, oh, this is what this random ugly dude on the internet said. But actually look at where this is coming from and say, okay, well, where do we dive into these things a little bit deeper? Because some of these conversations are a lot more complicated than we kind of want them to be, and how they're often presented. We need those nuances. We need to build that vocabulary, or we're never going to get anywhere.
I agree. And I also will have a link to the Serial Papers in the show notes. But for people who are just listening and don't want to click through, can you tell people where they can find your show on the Serial Papers website?
So the website I'm hoping to have up this weekend again. Unfortunately, we had to switch servers, so it's all down. But yeah, sirupapers.com, SIRU papers.com. Or you can just go to YouTube or Rumble and just type in Siru Papers. We're there. I'm on X. I need to figure out how to post stuff to X. So we're working on that one too. Actually, I just posted the link over there on X. And so yeah, SIRU Papers on YouTube, Rumble, or X, and I guess the interwebs, and will pop up.
Well, man, again, I always have such an amazing time chatting to you, Jason. And until I get to talk to you again, hopefully soon, and until I get to talk to everybody else out there, which is probably next Tuesday, same Untold Radio time, same Untold Radio channel, please keep it weird.